Hey guys, what's up? Welcome to another episode of Hockey on the Spot with Brandon Barenfeld. I'm Brandon Barenfeld. Thank you all for joining me today. This is episode 144 of Hockey on the Spot. And today, I'll be continuing with the NHL's 30 teams in 30 days. And for today, we are going to talk about the Minnesota Wild. Minnesota Wild, have been one interesting story lately. After missing the playoffs from 2009 to 2012, they set out to make some major signings during the lockout-shortened season. They brought in both Zach Parise and Ryan Suter from the New Jersey Devils and Nashville Predators, respectively, signing them both to long-term deals. They went on to have a very, very good year in the lockout-shortened year, but didn't last long in the playoffs. They were eliminated by the Chicago Blackhawks in 5 games. 2013-2014 comes around. No major signings or trade acquisitions for the Wild that time around. They just add some key pieces to revolve around Parise and Suter, and even Jason Pominville, whom they had acquired at the trade deadline in the lockout-shortened year. So they already had the pieces in place to have another good year, and they did just that. However, it was mostly homegrown success, and what I mean by that is the success of this team revolved around them being one of the best home teams in the league last year. Last year, they took a major step forward from the lockout-shortened year. To show how well they have improved, they were one of the best home teams in the National Hockey League. They were nearly unbeaten at home, and at home their record was 26-10-5, so only a total of 15 losses while playing on home ice. Once again, one of the best home teams in the league. If you just look at the home statistics, in the Western Conference alone, they were 5th in the league, which is just rather unbelievable when it comes down to it. Unfortunately, that same success could not be translated on the road, and it was their record on the road that prevented them from being a better team than they were. They were 9th in the Western Conference on the road. They got better toward the end on the road, but ultimately finished 17-17-7. So take out the overtime losses, they were exactly 500. Add those in, 24 losses on the road. Not good for the Wild. That is something they will definitely look to improve on going into this year. Then the playoffs come around, and after they finish the season 43-27-12, that was good enough for 98 points, and 4th in the Central Division, and 7th in the Western Conference, a step up from the previous year, winning the first wild card spot in the West. And for the Minnesota Wild, they will look to take another big step, and that step would be to win their first playoff series since winning 2 during the 2003 playoffs and going all the way to the Western Conference Finals. Since they went to the Western Conference Finals in 2003, they had not won a playoff series since that 7-game upset over the Colorado Avalanche. It would be the very same Colorado Avalanche franchise who they would play in the very first round. The new and improved Colorado Avalanche, might I add. So, and also the Central Division winners and the second seed in the West. The Avs would take on the Wild in the first round with home ice advantage obviously going to the Avs. And for the Wild, for them, it was all about their success at home that made their playoff success very good. Once again, they were nearly unbeaten on home ice in the playoffs, but they barely even get scratched off a win on the road. They surrendered the first 2 games in Colorado before coming back at home to tie up the series. Game 5 back in Colorado, the Avalanche go on to win that before the Wild managed to take Game 6 on their home ice. Before the Wild go on to take Game 6 on their home ice. Game 7 back in Colorado, very intense game that goes into overtime. Wild now in a position where they have to get one and only one road win in the playoffs to win the series, and Nino Niederreiter's overtime winner would do just that. Nino Niederreiter was pretty much the big addition for the Minnesota Wild over the 2013 offseason, coming after being selected 5th overall in 2010 by the New York Islanders. They got him in a trade that sent Cal Clutterbuck to the Islanders. And Niederreiter, though a disappointing New York Islanders career where he just couldn't seem to take that next step, with the Wild he was fantastic and is now showing why he was the 5th overall pick in the 2010 NHL draft, and he's only going to get better from here. But ultimately, he and his 2-goal performance and overtime winner would scratch out a 7-game series win over the Central Division winning Colorado Avalanche. They would then face off against the Chicago Blackhawks in a rematch from the previous year in the second round. Although this time, the Wild weren't exactly left for dead. After surrendering the first 2 games in Chicago, they would come back to tie the series through games 3 and 4, giving the Hawks a major scare in the second round. Unfortunately for the Wild, that's where it all had to come to an end. The Hawks would win Game 5 on their home turf before giving the Wild their first and only home loss in the playoffs, coming at the very wrong time for the Wild. They could not stretch it to a 7-game series, but ultimately the Wild would lose to the Chicago Blackhawks in 6 games in the second round. So, not a lot to be despite not going any farther than the second round. If you're the Minnesota Wild, there's not a lot to frown upon. They made some major strides into becoming an even better team, including winning a playoff series for the first time since 2003, which is a major step for the franchise, and giving the then defending Stanley Cup champions a really tough time in the postseason as well, which tells you that the Minnesota Wild are on the rise, and they really didn't need to do too much in order to make their team better. The only thing was, obviously, they had to get rid of some key pieces that they got from the trade deadline in order to get better now that their young talent is coming up. Forwards Matt Moulson and Cody McCormick, who they acquired from the Buffalo Sabres at the trade deadline, would go on to return to the Buffalo Sabres after signing with them again as unrestricted free agents. So Moulson and McCormick back with the Buffalo Sabres for a second time. Matt Moulson turned out to be a key piece to their team after he was acquired from the trade deadline, but they knew they had the ability to upgrade from Matt Moulson because as good as he was when he came over in the regular season, he was not very good in the playoffs, and hence one of the reasons why he was let go. As for Cody McCormick, he played in all the playoff games and was very good defensively. He is not a scorer. He only had one goal, but he's not a scorer. He is a fourth-line player, nothing else. They also lost defenseman Nate Prosser as he signed with the St. Louis Blues. The undrafted 28-year-old played a big role on their team last year, but could not come to terms with the 6'2", 203-pound right-shooting shutdown defenseman. He went to the division rival St. Louis Blues. Probably the big loss for the Minnesota Wild is defenseman Clayton Stoner. The reason being because they tried to come to terms with Clayton Stoner. This was a guy who they did not want to lose. He is a shutdown defenseman, and at 29 years of age, he'll be 30 in February. He has the potential to be a lot better, but for Stoner and the Wild, they could not come to terms, and also it was also a factor that Stoner wasn't realizing his full potential in Minnesota, and that he would probably have to go elsewhere in order for that to happen. So Clayton Stoner would go on to sign a pretty big deal for a player of his caliber, 4 years at $13.95 million or something like that with the Anaheim Ducks. Again, like I said, Matt Moulson is not the big loss for the Minnesota Wild because they wanted to let him go. Clayton Stoner is the big loss for the Minnesota Wild. He was a great player on their third defense pair, and he really solidified their back end. Then like I said, they tried to come to terms with him. They could not, and Stoner would go on to sign with the Anaheim Ducks. Joining him in Anaheim would also be forward Danny Heatley, as he could not realize his true potential in Minnesota and is hoping to get his career back in shape with the Anaheim Ducks as well. Those were guys who they were not. He was not someone they were going to bring back. Anyway. So, for the Minnesota Wild, for them this year, it's going to be all about the kids coming up and having the potential to take over the roster and make an impact. And so, they really didn't make too many big additions. Outside of one that I'm going to talk about in a second. But some of the other additions, Justin Falk comes back to the Minnesota Wild. This is Justin Falk returning to the Minnesota Wild, coming back over from the New York Rangers after leaving the Wild to sign with the Rangers as a restricted free agent. The Rangers did not qualify him, sending him into unrestricted free agency. He comes back to Minnesota to possibly be their seventh defenseman once again. Another player they would get from the New York Rangers is defenseman Stu Bickle, who has not played at the NHL level in a very long time, was a big part of the Rangers' 2011-2012 team that won the Eastern Conference and finished second in the league, and got all the way to the Eastern Conference Finals and lost to the New Jersey Devils in 6 games. He has really not been a solid NHL player since. He played a bit in the lockout-shortened year and was sent down and hasn't been called up since. Stu Bickle now joins Justin Falk and comes to the Minnesota Wild as well. And then, as he'll hope to try to get back to the NHL playing level in training camp. But other than that, again, really nothing significant. They got forward Joel Recklish coming over from the Washington Capitals. He'll be playing for the Iowa Wild of the American Hockey League. But he also has a couple games of NHL experience. Could potentially be called up if absolutely necessary. And they also brought in young centerman Jordan Schrader. They got him from the Vancouver Canucks. Jordan Schrader was not qualified by the Canucks. Therefore, he was put into unrestricted free agency. And he's really strange because he's 23 years of age. And he's got native of Lakeville, Minnesota. The former 22nd overall pick by the Canucks from the 2009 NHL draft. But this is a player who has yet to really come up to his potential. And it's, quite frankly, not going to get done in Vancouver. He's only 5'8", 175 pounds, but he's a right-handed shot. But this is a kid who has the potential, and he's still growing. It's not going to happen in Vancouver. Change was needed in order for Schrader to get his career up and running. And the Minnesota Wild is probably the best place to do it. He'll go into training camp with the mindset of trying to make the Wild lineup this year. This has to be a year for Jordan Schrader to make the lineup. If he does not make the lineup this year or within the next couple of years, then he will officially be a draft bust. Sad to say, because I actually like Jordan Schrader. I've seen him play. He's a very talented player. He's got talent. So why he's not playing at the NHL level yet and staying there is beyond me. So those are some really small additions, with Jordan Schrader being a decent-sized addition, in my opinion. He could steal a roster spot and play in the bottom six. But the real big addition for the Minnesota Wild this offseason, and their only significant free agent signing, came in the form of the number one unrestricted free agent on the market this season, left winger Thomas Vanek, who is coming over to the team from the Montreal Canadiens. Last season was a very interesting ride for Thomas Vanek, because, like Matt Moulson, he split the year between 3 different teams. He played the first 13 games of last year with his lone team, the Buffalo Sabres. Early on in the year, he was dealt to the New York Islanders, and he really gave them a boost. And with John Tavares and Kyle Oposo, formed what was at the time one of the best, if not the best, top lines in the National Hockey League, until John Tavares got hurt. After Vanek rejected a 7-year contract extension from general manager Garth Snow, he had to be traded, and he just managed to get traded just before the final minute struck on trade deadline day. He was dealt. Garth Snow turned down a very significant offer from the Anaheim Ducks and traded him to the Montreal Canadiens for a sole prospect in Sebastian Kohlberg and a second-round pick, not even a first-round pick. Vanek was pretty good for the Montreal Canadiens during the regular season. However, during the playoffs, he was not very good. Offensively was not the problem. It was defensively where his struggles came about. Though he did score 5 goals and 5 assists in the playoffs, he was a -4, and he looked very unmotivated at times. He looked like a guy who was really more or less just floating out there. Overall, last season, he finished off the year with 27 goals and 68 points. Which makes him, and at 30 years of age, he'll be 31 in January. That made him the most highly sought after UFA on the market, or at the very least the top ranked UFA. However, it was because of the fact that he's just a one-dimensional player that prevented him from being signed to longer and to more money. The Wild managed to get him at a bargain for a player of his caliber at just 3 years at around $19.5 million. So they actually got him for rather cheap for a player of his caliber. And if Thomas Vanek's playing at his best, though not a very good defensive player, one thing that they're going to definitely expect of him is to mold into their top 6, reunite with Jason Pominville, one of his closest friends with the Buffalo Sabres, and redevelop that chemistry with him while playing on a line that will probably have Michael Granlund centering both of those two. This guy is a pure sniper, great skating ability, great stick handling, great puck possession abilities, and can really fire the puck with that big wrister of his. He represented Team Austria during the Winter Olympics this past year, and he wasn't very good for Team Austria. And even though last year maybe wasn't the best season of his playing career, it was still a very good season for him while playing for 3 different teams. He now comes to the Minnesota Wild, the team that everyone believed he was going to go to in the offseason, and everyone's prediction was correct. The ties were just too... His ties to Minnesota just gave away too many answers, and so Thomas Vanek is now with the Minnesota Wild. And again, with adding him into the mix, which was really the only need for the Wild, all they really needed was another top 6 forward that can mold into probably the left wing side. They needed another top 6 left winger, and Thomas Vanek was the guy. That was their only real need this offseason. So every other area they felt they could fill from within their system. But now, the addition of Thomas Vanek instantly makes Minnesota's top 6 one of the deadliest in the National Hockey League. Which now takes us to some of the big questions in Minnesota this year. And probably the biggest question of all, who's the starting goaltender? Last year, the Minnesota Wild used 5 goaltenders: Nicklas Backstrom, Josh Harding, Darcy Kuemper, John Curry, and Ilya Bryzgalov, who they acquired pretty much at the trade deadline from the Edmonton Oilers. When he came over from the Edmonton Oilers, he became their starting goaltender for the rest of the year, and he was brilliant. After being so bad in Edmonton, he was brilliant in Minnesota and was their starter for most of the playoffs. For most of the playoffs. I mean, he went 3-6-1. He went 3-6 in the playoffs, but he played better than what his record showed. His success, like I said, he played better than his record showed. He started playing late in the series with the Colorado Avalanche after Darcy Kuemper had gotten hurt. Darcy Kuemper was the starter in the beginning of the playoffs, but he got hurt, and Ilya Bryzgalov had to take the mantle, and he led them to the Game 7 victory in Colorado. John Curry only had 1 start in the late season, and he won that 1 start. But then you have Darcy Kuemper, Josh Harding, and Nicklas Backstrom. Ilya Bryzgalov, more likely than not, is not going to be re-signed. Both he and Michael Rupp are still out there on the market. Both of them will not be back in Minnesota this year. Ilya Bryzgalov will not be back, but they still have the other 4. Nicklas Backstrom last year missed most of the season with health issues, with injury problems, and even when he was healthy, he looked like a very unmotivated goaltender, only going 5-11-2 through 21 games. Josh Harding was really the guy who was doing most of the damage for them, but he ended up missing the rest of the season with multiple sclerosis. But through 29 games, 18-7-3 with 3 shutouts, he was very, very good. But when you really look at it, Josh Harding's really a backup goaltender. He's not a guy that I personally would rely on as a starter, at least not yet. Darcy Kuemper is the young up-and-comer for the Minnesota Wild. He's 24 years of age, and he's got a lot of talent in that big 6'5", 205-pound frame. He's a left-handed goaltender. Through 26 starts, 12-8-4 with 2 shutouts, so 12-12 effectively. And then he was 3-1 with 1 shutout in 6 playoff games before getting hurt. So for the Minnesota Wild, they got a lot of questions. Kuemper, to me, because of Nicklas Backstrom's injury issues and Josh Harding, probably not going to have as good of a year because of the multiple sclerosis problems. Darcy Kuemper is probably going to be the guy going in, That is my guess. But he has to be a lot more consistent. He needs to be consistent, and he needs to prove that he can be a solid NHL starter because he has the tools to be a solid number one goaltender. There's no doubt about it. Where does newcomer Thomas Vanek fit? Okay, yeah, $19.5 million. I was right. Like I said, last season, 27 goals, 68 points in 78 games last season. He was traded twice. No, he has been such a good player since day one. And now you got to wonder if he's going to be able to thrive not being one of the top guys on the team because he's not going to be a top-line player in Minnesota when you really look at it. But, I mean, it is possible for him to be on the top line if he opts to move to the right side and maybe play on the top line with Mikko Koivu and Zach Parise. But otherwise, he would probably play on the left wing side on the second line with Jason Pominville and Michael Granlund. Charlie Coyle and Nino Niederreiter will most likely battle for that other top six spot. Is Matt Dumba ready for a regular spot on defense? There's a lot of high hopes for him. He played 13 games last year. He was the 7th overall pick of the 2012 NHL entry draft. And this is another PK Subban type defenseman, a physical defenseman who plays with a major edge, but can also play an excellent two-way game. So, lot to look forward to. Lots to look forward to with Matt Dumba. Will the kids keep blossoming? We got kids like Michael Granlund and Charlie Coyle, and even Nino Niederreiter made some major strides last year, and they have some more kids coming up like Jason Zucker and Zach Phillips, who will both battle for roster spots. They also have Eric Haula, another kid on the rise. He had a very good season last year at 23 years of age, a very good rookie season, and he's only going to get better. He was particularly great in the playoffs, so there's room for the kids to grow. And finally, are the Wild risking a burnout of defenseman Ryan Suter? Ryan Suter isn't really Mr. Everything like everybody thinks he is. He's a good defenseman. He's a very good defenseman, very talented, former 7th overall pick by the Nashville Predators from 2003. But most of the success he has and most of the attention that goes with him comes from his time on ice average. No defenseman or player saw more ice time than Ryan Suter last year. He averaged about 29 minutes and 24 seconds of ice time per game. And he's got all the potential. He's not a great puck-handling defenseman, and he's not necessarily the best skater. He does have a big shot, but he's more of a two-way defenseman than a pure offensive defenseman. Last year, 8 goals, 35 assists, and 43 points. A plus 15 rating. Usually one of the better plus-minus defensemen in the league. Only 34 penalty minutes and 150 shots on goal. Probably one of the best regular seasons, if not the best regular season he ever had in his career. One could argue that his final season with the Nashville Predators was better. In the playoffs, however, he wasn't really as good. He did have a goal and 6 assists for 7 points in 13 games, but he was a -5 with only 4 penalty minutes and 29 shots on goal. So he wasn't as good during the playoffs this year. He actually was a non-factor in the playoffs despite all the ice time he was getting. But, like I said, I think he's a good defenseman, but I don't think he's all that like everybody thinks he is. I think at times he is a little overrated and a little overpaid. That's just my opinion. What he managed to form, though, on the top defense pair with the youngster Jonas Brodin who's another kid who continues to get better, was something spectacular. They'll both be back on the same defense pair this year. But we'll see. We'll see. And another big question that I actually have that isn't on this top 5 questions list, can their captain, Mikko Koivu, stay healthy? Mikko Koivu has missed a lot of time in the last few years because of injury problems, and he's their captain. If you're not going to have your captain in your lineup, or your top line center for that matter, which he is, then you're going to have a lot of issues. And I think that Mikko Koivu has to come back and be healthy and really be a factor again. He's nowhere near the player he was, in my opinion. Still good enough to be a top-line center, solely because he's the most experienced guy on the team. I could see Mikael Granlund eventually taking over that spot, because he's 31 years of age, and last year, through 65 games, well, he was good, I guess. He only had 11 goals, but he had 43 assists for 54 points, an even rating, only 24 minutes in penalties, and 147 shots on goal. And in the playoffs, a goal and 6 assists for 7 points through 13 games, but a -4 and 10 penalty minutes and 30 shots on goal. So, but again, he missed a significant amount of time once again last year. This is a player whose health is just so inconsistent, and one would think that when he is healthy, he's maybe not playing to the best of his ability, at least not right now. He has the potential to put up more points, and he's still relatively young, and he's a big player too, 6'3", 222 pounds. So, it's going to be interesting to see the kind of impact that Mikko Koivu makes this year. But I think the key for the Wild is him managing to stay healthy. Which now takes us to the roster. As I said earlier, the top line, Mikko Koivu is definitely the top line center, and Zach Parise is definitely the top line left winger. But now who plays right wing on that top line? One's got to expect that maybe a guy like Charlie Coyle could be ready to take that next step, and play on that line with those two. And because he's only getting better from here. He's 22 years of age. And, though he may still need to find the defensive side of his game, offensively, he's very talented, possesses the puck well. I mean, he'll look to have a healthier year this year. And an even better year, because he's putting up the kind of numbers that make it look like a top 6 forward in the making, even a top line player in the making. I think the San Jose Sharks trading him away could prove to be one of the biggest mistakes they've ever made. On the second line, Mikael Granlund will definitely be the second line center, with Jason Pominville being the second line right winger. But then, of course, you got Thomas Vanek. Where are you going to slot him? Probably the best projected place. If he's not going to be willing to move to the right side to play on the top line with Zach Parise, he could play on the second line left wing spot next to Mikael Granlund and his old line mate Jason Pominville. It's actually rather interesting. I think Zach Parise, Mikko Koivu, and Mikael Granlund have the only solidified spots on the Wild. Mikael Granlund is definitely the second line center this year. He only had 8 goals last year, but had 33 assists in 41 points. But he was a -3, 22 penalty minutes, and 104 shots on goal. And last year in the playoffs, 4 goals, 3 assists, 7 points, +3, only 2 minutes in penalties, and 35 shots on goal. He took his game up another notch in the playoffs, but he did miss a significant amount of time last year. If I'm correct, he got injured early on in the year or something like that, or may have even been midway in the year. He got injured in November and didn't come back until December. So, he missed a significant amount of time this past year. But when he was in the lineup, he was so good with his hands. His hands are one of his best assets, and he's in the making to become a better player than before. But again, it's the two wing spots and the top line right wing spot that's still in question. Charlie Coyle is going to battle Jason Pominville for that top line spot because Pominville and Zach Parise were very deadly together last year, and they may not want to move that combination away just so Pominville could play with Vanek again. Coyle could end up being on the second line with Granlund, or you got Vanek who could play on that top line right wing spot, and then Charlie Coyle, though a right winger, could also play center. Put him at center and move Granlund to the left wing side. And, it's going to be interesting to see. I don't think we have a definite top six, because then you also have Nino Niederreiter, who's projected to play on the third line. Well, Nino Niederreiter still needs to get signed, though. That's the key here. Nino Niederreiter is a restricted free agent. They need to sign him, and there's no doubt that they're going to get him signed. He's another guy who's in position to battle for a top six spot. He had a breakout year last year, with 14 goals, 22 assists, and 36 points through 81 games, a plus 12 rating, 44 penalty minutes, and 143 shots on goal. And through 13 playoff games, 3 goals and 3 assists for 6 points, an even plus-minus rating, 8 penalty minutes, and 22 shots on goal. So he has truly become finally starting to become the player that everyone believed he had the potential to become. It wasn't getting done with the New York Islanders. It's getting done now with the Minnesota Wild. So he's another guy who could play on one of those spots. He's a left-handed shot, but he's playing on the right wing side. He could move to the left wing side. Who knows? It's really in question to who's got spots on the top line. Zach Parise is probably the most definite for the top line left wing spot, and Mikko Koivu for the top line center spot. Those positions are not changing. The other 4 spots, though, are in question. But what the third line could end up looking like as far as a projection, once Niederreiter gets signed, he'll probably play right wing on the third line with Erik Haula at the center position and Matt Cook on the left wing side. Matt Cook was actually probably the big addition for the Wild during the 2013 offseason. And last year, the grinding defensive forward was actually pretty good. He didn't score a whole lot, but he's not that type of a player to begin with. But he did ultimately go on to have a good season. So, Matt Cook, at 35 years of age, he'll be 36 once training camp comes around, still has the abilities to be a really good player, and he'll help out that third line and then give it some energy. And then the fourth line, not a physical fourth line by any means. Kyle Brodziak is the projected center for that fourth line. Again, another really gifted depth player, a very valuable depth player to have in the lineup. He does take some penalty minutes, but not a guy who drops the gloves often. Justin Fontaine, who showed promise last year as a solid goal scorer, he'll probably man the right wing side on that fourth line. And then it's in question who could have that left wing side, one projects that Jason Zucker could finally break out and play that fourth line left wing spot. He's a guy who plays a grindy type style but also scores. And he also has the potential to move on higher from that fourth line spot and maybe potentially move a guy like Matt Cook down to the fourth line. Because Jason Zucker, his time is running out. If he wants to be a part of this Wild team, he needs to make the lineup roster full-time this year. There's no question about it. So that's what the top 12 could look like. And then you got guys like Cody Almond and Stefan Veilleux who could make up the 13th and 14th forward spots. Cody Almond has played a few NHL games already, He didn't play at all the last couple of years. He could be ready to come back and be on the team this year. But they also have a couple of other forwards who are going to battle as well. Now, forward Jordan Schrader and forward Zach Phillips. Those two are players who could both be ready to be in the lineup full time if both of them have good training camps. It's all going to come down to the training camps. And hey, those are two guys who could push a couple of forwards to be traded. You never know. It's going to be interesting to see. So up front, there's absolutely no problems. The Wild have one of the deepest forward cores in the National Hockey League. They are going to be a good scoring team for years to come. Offense is probably the biggest strength to their team, which is very weird saying because throughout their franchise history, they've always been known to play more of a defensive style. They've always played more of a defensive style. That mindset has changed to play more of an offensive, high-tempo style. Because on defense, there are some questions. There's no denying the top pairing of Ryan Suter and Jonas Brodin. Brodin made some excellent strides last year and had a very good season. He's a player on the rise, and he's only going to get better. He'll continue to play with Ryan Suter. On the second pairing, you got Marco Scandella and Jared Spurgeon. Both of them had breakout years last year and are now officially full-time defensemen. They're both now ready to be in the top four. They'll both be top four defensemen. Scandella is the shutdown defenseman, and Spurgeon is the offensive defenseman. But both of them were excellent last year. On the third defense pair, though, is where you have problems. Is where the questions come in because again they lost Nate Prosser to the St. Louis Blues and Clayton Stoner to the Anaheim Ducks, and between the two of them, they really wanted to keep Clayton Stoner because he really solidified their blue line on that third pair. They now have to trust their gut and go with guys who, maybe a guy like Keith Ballard who did play more than half the year last year, but was really the seventh defenseman last year in his first year with the Minnesota Wild. They may now be in a position where they'll have to make Keith Ballard a full-time player playing on the third defensive pair. And who his defense partner could be? Maybe it'll be a major battle between guys like Matt Dumba, Jonathan Blum, and Christian Folin, a top college player, a top college prospect. He's projected to be in the lineup this year. And Justin Falk, the returnee from the New York Rangers, is probably the seventh guy, or projected to be such. Christian Folin is going to be a very good player, but he'll have to battle, again, Matt Dumba and Jonathan Blum to get that spot. And one's got to think that even though the roster here projects Christian Folin to play alongside Keith Ballard, one's got to think that Matt Dumba is probably going to push one of those two guys out. Keith Ballard's spot in the lineup is not a safe one because he's nothing more than a seventh defenseman at this point in his career. So the defense group, even without Clayton Stoner, I actually think is decent, but it's nowhere near as good as their forward core. The real problem lies in the crease. They have Darcy Kemper projected to be the starter and Nicholas Backstrom projected to be the backup, but they still have Josh Harding and they still have John Curry. John Curry's most likely going to go back to the American Hockey League and be the starter for the Iowa Wild. And Darcy Kemper, like Nino Niederreiter, is a restricted free agent, so he needs to get signed. They are going to get Darcy Kemper signed. They believe he has the talent to be their number one. He's got the size as well. But it's a really unsettling position right now in goal. And this is probably the biggest goaltender controversy in the league. They're not bringing back Ilya Bryzgalov, so they don't need to worry about that. But Darcy Kemper's really going to have to prove himself and prove that he can be a solid number one. Backstrom's going to have to come back, be healthy, and play good when given the opportunity to play. And if Josh Harding can overcome his multiple sclerosis, well then, he can come in and be a good goaltender and push someone like Nicklas Backstrom out of the lineup and maybe push him to get traded. You know? Nicklas Backstrom's not getting any younger, and the prime years of his career are over. There's no doubt about that. The prime years of his career are over. I mean, when you really look at it, he's 36 years of age and he'll be 37 in February. The prime years of his career are done. But Josh Harding still got some youth left in him, and I could see him overtaking Nicklas Backstrom's spot in the lineup. But Darcy Kuemper, I think, is going to be experimented as the starter, at least early on in the year. He has the tools to be a solid NHL starting goaltender. As we now go and take a look at the top 10 prospects for the Minnesota Wild. This is kind of an interesting top prospect pool, I'd have to say. Hey, in this sense, they have a lot of players on this top 10 pool that are ready to play as soon as the season. Matt Dumba is their number 1 prospect, without a doubt. Christian Folin is their number 2 prospect. And then their number 4 prospect, Brett Bulmer, who's another guy who's going to battle for a spot this year. He's been itching to get in the lineup full time for quite some time now. He's been in the lineup before, so you got to anticipate that Bulmer has the makings of a good depth player. But then they also have Gustav Olofsson as their number 3, Tyler Glauvac as number 5, Alex Tuch, number 6, Johan Gustafsson, their number 7. He's another goaltender who has the potential to be a starter 2 years down the road. Mario Lucia, 3 years down the road. He's going to be a roster player. There's no doubt about that. Zach Mitchell is number 9, and Curtis Gabriel is number 10. Curtis Gabriel has, he's a guy who's knocking on the door. But honestly, when you really look at this top 10 prospect pool, to be really honest with you, there aren't too many guys in this particular prospect pool that really stand out to me. I mean, I think Matt Dumba is a very impressive player, and I think he is without a doubt the next PK Subban. I've never seen Christian Folin play, but if he's as good as everyone says he's supposed to be, then he's going to help out the Wild a lot. And then I've heard stories about Gustav Olofsson. I mean, he's another year away, but I've heard stories about him and how he's supposed to be a very good goalie in the future. And then, of course, Brett Bulmer is their top forward. And I know about Johan Gustafsson as well. But to be honest with you, I'm really not that impressed with this top 10 prospect pool. I think it is weaker. So far, it is the weakest top 10 prospect pool in the Central Division. Weaker than the Winnipeg Jets, weaker than the Nashville Predators, and weaker than the Dallas Stars. There's no doubt about that. However, there was actually one prospect that always did stand out to me here. The prospect that stands out to me is their number 6 prospect, right winger, Alex Tuch. The native of Blanesville, New York. Well, born in Blanesville, New York, but raised in Syracuse. Formerly the next-door neighbor of former NHL center and former 5th overall pick from 1999, Tim Connolly, New York Islanders 5th overall pick. And Alex Tuch was their first-round 18th overall pick in this year's past draft. And this kid is a big, big player. 6'4", 213 pounds, a right-handed shot. This is a power forward. He is a pure power forward. He uses his body to get to the net. Through 61, he played for the United States National Team Development Program, the Under-18 program for the United States Hockey League. Through 61 games played with them, 29 goals, 34 assists, and 63 points. So he was over a point-a-game player, and he's only going to get better, and he's only 2 years away from being a full-time roster player, and he has the potential to represent Team USA at the 2015 World Junior Championships. I've seen a couple of highlights of this kid, nothing really too serious, but from what I've seen from this kid, I like what I see. This is a pure power forward, a Rick Nash type of player. It definitely comes off as an American Rick Nash, and he is going to be a top 6 forward in the future. There's no doubt about it. Whether it's with the Wild or with another team, if the Wild's top 6 becomes too good to have him in the lineup, but this kid's got all the tools to be a real good NHL player one day. He could even end up being one of the steals of the first round in a draft that, quite frankly, did not look very promising compared to drafts past and compared from what's to come in 2015. So we'll see. But overall, Alex Tuch is my highlight prospect, and he's the first 2014 draft NHL entry drafted player to be a highlight prospect in my book. Now, the player on the Minnesota Wild who I think needs to be good and needs to be better in order for the Minnesota Wild to be a playoff team this year, in order to get back to the playoffs. With the Wild, with any team, you always got to fall back on the goaltending. And one could say for the Minnesota Wild, they could probably live up to that saying more than any other team right now. Their goaltending situation right now is an absolute mess, and that is their big weakness right now. They're not even that deep when it comes to their goaltending either. Their goaltending has a lot of questions, and but you can't. As much as you want to pick a goaltender to be the player that needs to be better, I really can't, only for this reason. They have so many goaltenders who are battling for the number 1 spot, so you really can't just pick one who has to be better, because you don't know which one is going to be the number 1. And Darcy Kemper, he's still a restricted free agent. They got to get him signed. Same with Nino Niederreiter. They got to get him signed. In my opinion, the player who needs to be better for the Minnesota Wild in order for them to be a better team, believe it or not, is going to fall back on their captain, Mikko Koivu. Mikko Koivu is the player who has to be better. Not only better, but healthier as well. Last season, again, was not his best year. I mean, he put up some pretty decent offensive numbers. 54 points is not that bad. And 54 points through 65 games is not that bad, and those 43 assists really stand out. And he wasn't a plus player, but he wasn't a minus either. He was an even rating, and he was very clean. He stayed out of the box, only 24 minutes in penalties, and he had 147 shots on goal, which is very good for a playmaker. But the issues are he only had 11 goals, and he only played 65 games. Even though he was completely healthy during the lockout-shortened year, he didn't play like a player who was completely healthy. He did not have a good lockout-shortened year as far as his offense was concerned. 2011, 2012, he was out he spent a lot of time injured that year. But he hasn't put up the same kind of offensive numbers since 2010, 2011. This is a guy who you expect to get at least 60 points and at least 17 goals. Those are the numbers you want from a guy like Mikko Koivu. So only 11 goals and only 54 points is not good. And he needs to stay healthy. He's the captain of their team. And even in the playoffs, offensively, he was actually good in the playoffs. He took it up to another level offensively. Defensively, though, he was a -4 in the playoffs, and he only had 30 shots on goal. And he had 10 penalty minutes as well. So he took a few penalties throughout the playoffs. So, in my opinion, in order for the Minnesota Wild to be a better team, their captain, Mikko Koivu, has to be better, and he has to stay healthy. Because, again, the younger brother of Saku Koivu is a really a 60 to 70 point guy. And those are the numbers you expect from him. And if he's not putting up those numbers, then you got a problem. And if he can't get back to that level of play, then it's time to trade him and time to go explore the idea of getting a better number one center. Even if it is from within your own system, which the Wild, for the kids coming up, have a lot of. Which actually falls back on as to why their top 10 prospect pool isn't even that good this year. Because a lot of the players who made up their top 6 group last year and made it deeper than it was this year are now ready to play in the NHL. Which is a good thing, but from the standpoint of having a deep pool, that's the only downside. But there's a lot to look forward to in Minnesota, though. There really is. Overall, do I think the Minnesota Wild are a playoff team? To me, once again, it really depends. It's kind of a similar situation with the Dallas Stars. They're in that bubble group, and there's always room to get better. But you got to look at the teams ahead of them. The St. Louis Blues, the Chicago Blackhawks, the Colorado Avalanche. Those teams have gotten better. The Avalanche, despite the loss of Paul Stastny, have gotten better. They're a better team today than they were yesterday, and their kids are only getting older. Their kids are coming up. Nathan MacKinnon is a great player. He has the makings to be a superstar in the near future. So, for those 3 locations, there's a lot to look forward to. For the Minnesota Wild, it's really going to depend on if their goaltending is going to be able to hold up, If not, then they're going to have some problems this year. However, if I'm going to take a guess, I will actually say yes. I do think the Wild are a playoff team. I mean, you can't deny that offensive group, even if the goaltending is bad. I think that offense is enough to propel them to the next level. The addition of Thomas Vanek only makes them better, and it makes them a deeper forward group today than they were yesterday. So, defense, you have questions, but it's still a solid enough defense pair. It's not the worst defense pair in the league. They got a very solid top 4. All the weaknesses really come on that bottom pair. Other than that, they have a great top 4 with Suter, Brodin, Scandella, and Spurgeon. They may have to be smart and not give Ryan Suter as much playing time without the risk of burning him out and making him play not up to his full potential. That's a big concern. Hopefully the Wild will realize this and not put him out on the ice more than they should be. But overall, I think they'll get that goaltending situation straightened out. I like Darcy Kemper. I think he'll come up and be a good goaltender for them. So overall, I say the Wild do get back into the playoffs, but I don't see them getting any higher than maybe a 6th seed. I mean, I can see them getting past the wild card, but, and saying to them that they have the potential to knock off one of the 3 division winners is a stretch. I don't see them being anywhere past a wild card team, really. Like the Dallas Stars, the other 3 teams have just gotten so much better. I mean, one could say that maybe the Colorado Avalanche, despite that they were the division winners last year, they could very easily have a setback year and go back to being the team that they were for the last couple of years and be a last place team again. That could definitely happen if their youngsters go through a sophomore jinx. And that would be the Wild's opportunity of knocking to take one of the division spots, one of the division winning spots for the Central Division. But I don't see that happening. I think the Avalanche are too good for that. And we'll talk more about the Avalanche when we get to their video in a few days. But overall, I'll say yes. The Minnesota Wild are a playoff team. They're a wild card team. Again, they'll be a wild card team again, and they'll be in that bubble group with the Dallas Stars and the Arizona Coyotes, and even the Nashville Predators. But yes, the Minnesota Wild, they are a playoff team. They are going to be back in the playoffs for the 3rd straight year. And so, Minnesota fans, you have a lot to look forward to this year. The Minnesota Wild are a playoff team. And that will do it for episode 144 of Hockey on the Spot. Be sure to tune in tomorrow, everyone. Thank you all for joining me today. Be sure to tune in tomorrow when we talk about the team that is 2 years removed from its second Stanley Cup in 4 years, the Chicago Blackhawks. So until then, this has been Hockey on the Spot with Brandon Barenfeld. I'm Brandon Barenfeld. Thank you all for joining me, and I'll see you all again tomorrow. Thank you, and have a great day.